They were high school sweethearts, and February the 12th in 1971 was the last holiday that 19-year-old Jesse McBane and 20-year-old Patricia Mann would ever celebrate. Patricia was a 20-year-old college student at Watts Hospital in Durham, North Carolina, and Jesse was a freshman at North Carolina State University, and there was a dance on the campus of Watts Hospital on February the 12th. Jesse and his brother shared the car, and it wasn't his night, but he made a deal with his brother and they traded days, so Jesse got the car at the last minute. So they went to the dance and they had a good time, and around 11:30 they left the dance, and Patricia signed out of her dorm, which had extended its curfew from midnight to 1 a.m. because of the dance. They took Jesse's car and drove to the unofficial lover's lane that was used by the nursing students, but the following morning, Patricia's absence was immediately noticed at the dorm, and she wouldn't miss her curfew or not return to her dorm without a reasonable explanation, so they knew that something was wrong. They started to call local hospitals, thinking that maybe she and Jesse had been in a car accident. They also filed a report with the Durham County Police Department, while some of Patricia's co-workers from the hospital went out to look for her and Jesse. They went to the Lover's Lane area, and that's where they found Jesse's car. The car was locked, and neither he or Patricia were in the car, but their coats were in the back seat. But other than that, there wasn't anything unusual about the car. And police had ignored the case at first because they thought that the couple had just run away or eloped. And a few days later, the investigation began. Patricia and Jesse had been missing for about 2 weeks when police got a call from a man who said that his dreams usually came true. He told police that Patricia and Jesse had been killed by a priest and he had left their bodies in Crowsdale. He told them that he didn't dream a lot, but when he did, they came true. For nearly 2 weeks, authorities searched for Patricia and Jesse, while Durham and Orange County detectives worked on the leads that were coming in. Sadly, 12 days later, around 1:40 p.m. on February the 25th, a surveyor that was working in a wooded area found 2 bodies tied to a tree in Crowsdale. It was Jesse and Patricia. Their hands had been tied with thick ropes behind their backs, and they were tied to a tree, and ropes were stretched tight and knotted around their necks. Their bodies were partially covered by leaves and other debris, so the surveyor thought that it was a mannequin at first. But as he got closer, he realized that it was a person. Their upper bodies had slumped over and they were leaning on each other. And during autopsy, it was also discovered that Patricia also had a 1/2-inch tear to her liver, which they think she got by being punched. It looked like Patricia and Jesse had been strangled and then let down. Then they were strangled and then let down again, over and over again, to the point where their shoes still had mud on them, and you could tell that their feet had been kicking around. After their bodies were found, an extensive investigation began. The Orange County and Durham County Sheriff's Offices, the Durham Police Department, the SBI, the FBI, and what was then called the Department of License and Theft, which would eventually be a part of the North Carolina DMV. Because their kidnapping and death happened in different counties, multiple police precincts were involved and they were reluctant to share information with each other. There was a lot of work being done, but it was on an individual basis. They weren't sharing information with each other, and this really hurt the case. Eventually, police had a few promising suspects, and some were later cleared because of polygraph tests, and some weren't. One that wasn't cleared was a doctor who worked at Watts Hospital and knew Patricia, and he refused to cooperate with the authorities, and he was a focus in the case, and he's still a focus in the case to this day. And as of 2020, he was still alive. Although no one has been charged with the murders, there is a possibility that the Orange County Sheriff's Office could eventually catch a huge break in the case. Thankfully, those ropes were preserved and protected, and one day, hopefully, we'll have an answer. In 2000, Columbine High School sweethearts Stephanie Hart Grizzell, 16, and Nick Kunselman, 15, were killed at the Subway restaurant where Nick worked. Just less than a year earlier, 12 of their classmates and a teacher had been killed in the Columbine massacre, but the two were able to get through it together, and they were a happy couple. On that night, Stephanie had snuck out of the house and went to Subway to pick Nick up from work, and around midnight, another employee had driven by the restaurant and noticed the lights were still on. The employee went to take a look inside, and there he found Stephanie and Nick dead behind the counter. They had been shot to death. When Kelly Grizzell, Stephanie's mother, woke up the next morning, she turned on the television and she saw the news. 2 people had been killed at the Subway shop in Littleton. The camera showed the parking lot and she saw her daughter's car. She didn't know why her daughter would be there and she was very, very worried. Police pulled up to her house to give her the news. There were only a few credible leads, and investigators initially released a description of the suspect. A white male, 16 to 20 years old, about 5'7" and between 150 to 170 pounds, with blondish hair. And those details resulted in tips from around the country, and several people confessed, but the tips eventually fizzled out and the confessions were false. Stephanie's mother thought that the case would be solved within days, but it dragged on and it's still unsolved. The reward for information in the case has been increased from $12,000 to $100,000 in 2021. Anyone with information about the murders is asked to contact Metro Denver Crime Stoppers at 720-913-7867, or you can submit a tip anonymously via the link in the description. On Valentine's Day 2010, Stacey Schoeck hired police trainer and hitman Reginald Coleman, aka Mr. Results, to shoot her husband in Belton Bridge Park for $10,000. The park was in a remote area and it was very, very dark. You couldn't see your hand before your face, and it was the perfect spot for a murder. She lured her 5th husband, Richard, there by telling him that she wanted to meet to exchange Valentine's Day cards that night and maybe spend a little alone time together like they did when they were dating. From the crime scene, police knew that Richard had gotten out of his truck to approach the person with the gun because his truck was still running and the door was open when his body was found. He was shot a total of 5 times, with 3 of the bullets passing through his body, and he was shot twice in the face from very close range, and the bullets penetrated his brain and his spinal cord. Stacey learned about Mr. Results through a friend of hers that she worked with. Her name was Lenitra Ross, and she was in an on-again, off-again relationship with him. So Stacey and Lenitra met at a Mexican restaurant one day, and they worked out the details of the murder plot. And bank and phone records proved that Stacey had given Lenitra Ross thousands of dollars around the same time that Richard was killed. That money was for Reginald, Mr. Results. Stacey was also having an affair with someone that she worked with, and Richard had a life insurance policy that was worth $500,000. But that isn't why she killed him. She killed him because she said that divorce wasn't an option, because she believed that Richard may have gotten custody of the children, and she was not willing to let that happen. But it took her about 7 months to come clean and admit everything. Richard hadn't done anything to warrant the way that he was killed. By all accounts, he was a really good man that wanted to adopt 2 of Stacey's 3 children because he loved them and he treated them like they were his own. He was a golf course superintendent and also a Boy Scout leader. He operated hot air balloons and was a very community-oriented and a very compassionate person. He just married the wrong woman. And during the trial, she said that she wanted the murder to look like a robbery, so she was angry with Reggie that he didn't take anything of Richard's. And she testified against Reginald Coleman and Lenitra Ross in order to avoid the death penalty. And all 3 of them were sentenced to life in prison without parole, and Stacey pleaded for mercy during her sentencing. On February the 14th, 2005, 19-year-old Rashawn Brazell of Brooklyn, New York, left the apartment that he shared with his mom and his stepdad at 1091 Gates Avenue in Bushwick. It was the last time that his mother, Desire, would see him alive, and they were supposed to get together later that day for Valentine's brunch. Around 7:30 that morning, an unknown person rang the apartment building's security buzzer, and Rashawn went down to meet the person. And according to other witnesses, he met a man outside his apartment, and the 2 of them entered the subway together at the Gates Avenue station. Witnesses believe that the 2 exited the station, but Rashawn was never seen alive again. 3 days later, at 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 transit workers found a blue bloody recycling bag with severed legs, a right shoulder, and a right arm inside. The legs had been cut off below the hips. The bags were found shoved between the tracks and the tunnel wall near an emergency exit that leads to the street above, and there weren't any signs that the bag had been dragged along the track bed. The transit workers were setting up lights for a cleaning crew when they noticed a bare foot sticking out of the bag. And when the workers started screaming, they didn't understand what he was saying at first. He was screaming, "There's a leg," but at first they thought that someone was under the train. They said at first when you looked at it, it didn't look real, but then under the bag you could see a trail of blood. In addition to all of that, police later found a second bag full of bloody tools and drill bits close by. 5 days later, a piece of Rashawn's pelvis was found buried in a pile of papers by trash collectors at Rapid Processing in Greenpoint, nearly 5 miles from the subway station. A clerk said it was really hard to tell what they were looking at because the remains were so decomposed that it looked like the person was actually wearing clothes. DNA evidence proved that an empty black bag sitting in the subway tunnel was used to carry Rashawn's body. His head and arm have never been found. He was identified by his fingerprints because he had a misdemeanor marijuana charge on his record, and the cuts on his body were so clean and precise that authorities believed the killer had medical experience or at least knowledge of anatomy. Police want to find the spot where he was killed because the site would more than likely have forensic evidence. They also want to know how he was killed. Rashawn was described as caring, energetic, and grounded. He loved music, cooking, designing, and making his own clothes and going to clubs. He had also planned to do some job hunting the day that he disappeared. And for more than 10 years, there were no answers, so the case was featured multiple times on America's Most Wanted. 12 years later, thankfully, police finally had a suspect. His name was Kwayahuru Govan. Govan liked to have a power over people. He wanted people to be afraid of him. Sometimes he would be outside without a shirt on, and a huge snake would be wrapped around his neck. Other times he would wear contacts that made his eyes look like snake eyes. A neighbor said that the snake was the size of a banister on a 5-step stoop. He was described as a moody man who would play with his 2 children at their home in Bushwick, and he was a career criminal. His first arrest was in 1996 when he was sentenced for 30 days in a juvenile facility for grand larceny. In 2017, he was already in prison because in February 2004, he murdered 17-year-old Sharabia Thomas. He was arrested while in prison in Rikers Island for Rashawn's murder, and he was charged with second-degree murder, and DNA linked him to the crime. Sharabia was last seen by her younger sister, and her body was found hours later abandoned in an alley stuffed in a laundry bag. When cops arrested him for her murder, he was serving time in Florida for armed robbery. Govan lived across the street from Rashawn and Sharabia, and he even attended Rashawn's funeral. However, he also said that he was in St. Louis learning to drive a truck when the crime took place and that he had never spent time with Rashawn, who he described as an abomination because he was gay. At his arraignment in Brooklyn Supreme Court, he was dragged into the courtroom by several officers, and he was screaming that he was being framed for murder and that he couldn't even dissect a frog. He also refused to be fingerprinted, but an order was eventually given that permitted officers to take his prints by any means necessary. In 2018, Govan received 25 years to life for Sharabia's death. And after so many years of the case going unsolved, Rashawn's family, friends, and the detectives that worked so diligently on the case are relieved to finally have the person responsible behind bars. And Govan is still awaiting trial for Rashawn's murder. And Rashawn's family hopes that one day all of his remains will be found so that he can finally rest in peace.